Black CEO cancels $900 million deal after his mother is publicly humiliated. What would you do if someone disrespected your mother in front of the world? Would you stay silent for the sake of money or walk away from $900 million to defend her dignity? This is the story of a black CEO who did exactly that. Not out of pride, not for headlines, but because some deals come with chains and he chose freedom instead. What happened next shocked the elite and inspired a movement. Black CEO's mother humiliated at country club entrance. The black Lincoln Navigator eased into the sunlit driveway of Greenwich Country Club. The morning air was crisp, the sky cloudless. Ivy curled up the stone pillars and the hedges were cut to perfection. Every detail whispered old money. A valet in a red vest stepped forward, barely finishing his greeting before the rear door opened. Out stepped Gloria Samuels. She wore her white church hat, wide-brimmed with a cream ribbon to match her shoes. Not designer, not expensive, but dignified. Her dress was soft blue, with pressed seams, clean lines, and decades of careful grace stitched into every fold. She held her leather purse close, the same one she carried to Sunday service and hospital visits, funerals, and family graduations. Today, it was her son's day. Derek had told her it would be a small celebration. No cameras. No speeches, just a quiet toast after the final papers were signed. She hadn't asked about numbers. She didn't care how many zeros were on the check. She came for one reason, because her son asked. She took one step onto the marble walkway, then another. She was halfway up the steps when a woman in a navy blue jacket blocked her path. "Excuse me," the woman said, no smile, no kindness in her tone. Deliveries and staff use the back entrance. Gloria blinked just once. "I'm here for lunch," she said calmly, "with my son, Derek Samuels." The woman didn't flinch. "Yes, well, if you're with staff or catering, it's policy. Rear access is to the left." Gloria tilted her head slightly, like she had done all her life when faced with thinly veiled disrespect dressed as professionalism. "I'm not staff," she said softly. "I'm a guest." She spoke with grace, but the sting had already landed. This wasn't new. Just another old wound reopened under a new uniform. Across the courtyard, Derek Samuels stood by a long white table draped in linen, a champagne flute in his hand. The sun caught the edge of the glass, and for a moment he looked peaceful. Then he saw his mother, saw the way the woman's arms stretched out across the walkway, saw the confusion on Gloria's face and the rigidness in her shoulders. His smile fell. Back at the steps, Gloria tried to keep her voice calm. "You can check the list," she said. "My name is Gloria Samuels. My son is one of the owners meeting here today." Before the woman could reply, another voice cut through the patio. "Well," it said, laced with sugar and venom, "I suppose they're letting anyone in these days." Victoria Hathaway. She stood a few feet away, pearls at her throat, a glass of white wine in hand. Her blouse was bone white, her heels clicking softly on the stone. "Are we dining with the cleaning staff now?" she added, raising an eyebrow. A man chuckled nearby. Another turned his head to watch. Gloria didn't move. Her hands clutched her purse tighter, but her chin didn't lower. Derek was already walking. He reached the steps, one hand on the railing, the other reaching gently for his mother's arm. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet, steady. She nodded, but her voice trembled. "I don't want to make a fuss, baby." He looked at her. "I know you don't," he said, "but I will." Then he turned to the staff woman, whose face had gone pale. "This is my mother," he said evenly. "The most important person in this building, and you just disrespected her." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Without raising his voice, without a threat or curse, Derek turned, walked his mother back down the steps, and opened the car door himself. Before he closed it, Gloria touched his arm. "Don't ruin your moment over me," she said. He looked at her, eyes full of something deeper than anger. "You are the moment." Then he shut the door gently and walked back toward the club, through the same marble steps that had just disrespected the woman who raised him. What he did next would shake boardrooms from coast to coast. But in that moment there was no audience, just a mother, a son, and a silence louder than any scream. A son walks away from power after seeing his mother disrespected. Derek stood still for a second longer than he usually allowed himself. His hand rested lightly on his mother's shoulder, as if he were anchoring her back to dignity that had been stripped in an instant. Gloria sat inside the SUV now, her posture straight but her eyes softer than before. She was trying to stay composed for him, but Derek had already seen it. He had seen the look in her eyes. That split-second flicker, not shock. Not confusion, something heavier. The ache of knowing, once again, that no matter how far her son had climbed, some people still saw her as nothing but someone who didn't belong. He closed the door quietly. No slam, no scene. As he walked back up the marble steps, the wind picked up, lifting the edge of the tablecloths on the terrace. Champagne bottles glistened on silver trays. The clink of glasses continued. Conversations resumed, but not for Derek. Inside, the room buzzed with carefully orchestrated celebration. Executives from Hathaway, lawyers in tailored suits, tech founders, polished, postured, and pretending the air didn't feel different now. Derek crossed the room like a man walking through fog. Eyes followed him, but no one dared speak. He made it to the long table set up for the signing, untouched documents waiting like an altar to ambition. A black and gold pen sat on top. He didn't reach for it. Preston Ward, legal counsel for the Hathaway Group, approached with an artificial calm. "Everything all right?" Derek's fingers curled around the back of his chair. He didn't sit. "I need to say something." The room didn't quiet. It froze. "You all know what this day was supposed to be, for the companies, for the market, for the vision we sold to the next generation." He paused. His eyes scanned every face one by one until they landed on Victoria Hathaway. "But I'm not signing." The murmurs began immediately, confused voices under breath. A chair creaked. Someone said, "Wait, what?" Softly, like they weren't sure if they were allowed to say it louder. Victoria turned her head slowly. Her pearl earrings caught the light. She smiled, a cold thing dressed up in charm. "Is this a negotiation tactic?" she asked, half a laugh. Derek shook his head. "No, it's clarity." "You can't be serious," Preston said, his voice tight. "I'm not signing." Victoria's smile faded at the edges. "If there's a concern," she said, "we can address it professionally." "I didn't recognize the woman. That's all it was." Derek looked at her for a long beat. His voice, when it came, was soft. "That woman is my mother." Victoria leaned back, still trying to maintain control. "I'm aware now. But surely you don't mean to walk away over a misunderstanding." He cut her off. "You didn't misunderstand anything. You said exactly what you meant." Preston interjected again, clearly panicking now. "We've invested millions. Dozens of firms are watching this go through. If this falls apart..." "Then it falls apart," Derek said, "but not on silence." The words hung there, waited. He glanced at the papers, one signature away from generational wealth. From a seat at every table Dee once told him he'd never earn. But then he saw her again. Gloria. Not how she looked when she arrived, radiant and proud, but how she looked the moment they told her she didn't belong. How she stood anyway. "I won't build my future on top of that," Derek said. Victoria narrowed her eyes. "Don't be emotional," she muttered. Derek stepped forward slowly. You think I built this from a corner office? I loaded trucks. I drove routes at 3 a.m. I watched my mother scrub houses so I could have light to study by. So when she walks in wearing her finest and you humiliate her in front of strangers. His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. You humiliate me. Silence. There were deals that people lost sleep over not signing, but not this one. He stepped back from the table and walked out, leaving the pen untouched, the contract unsigned, and the room so quiet it hummed. Outside, the sky had dimmed slightly. A breeze moved through the trees. Derek looked up once toward where his mother sat waiting in the SUV. She looked back at him through the window, proud, sad, unshaken. He had done what she had never asked him to do, and everything she had raised him to do. Black CEO shocks room by refusing $900 million deal over racism. The room didn't exhale, not when Derek walked in, not when he reached the table, and definitely not when he walked out again without touching the pen. It was as if the air had changed weight. The contract sat on the table, thick and immovable, still warm from the hands that had carried it in. The pen beside it, sleek gold, engraved, weighted like a symbol of power, of legacy, of the price they all thought he was ready to pay. But his chair remained empty. Victoria Hathaway kept her fingers laced neatly on the table. She didn't blink, didn't frown, but her pearl earrings didn't seem to shine as much anymore. Across from her, Preston Ward, the family's general counsel, flipped the first page of the contract like he was trying to rewind time. He couldn't because Derek's absence now filled the room louder than his presence ever had. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply looked into the eyes of the people who had disrespected his mother and said, without words, "I don't sell my soul in suits." Someone at the far end of the table cleared their throat, unsure whether to speak. Bradley Hathaway leaned toward his brother and whispered, "He just left, like left." Preston finally stood. "We should give him a moment, let things cool." But it wasn't heat that made Derek walk away. It was cold. Cold like the look in Victoria's eyes when she dismissed Gloria Samuels as if she were staff. Cold like the unspoken rules of rooms like this, where pedigree counted more than humanity. Where black mothers weren't meant to walk in proud, only to serve, clean, wait, and disappear. Clinton Hathaway leaned back slowly, speaking low. "You saw what just happened, right? He wasn't bluffing." Victoria didn't answer. She just reached for her wine glass and sipped slowly, holding eye contact with no one, but her hand trembled just enough for her son to notice. "You underestimated him," Clinton added. "You always underestimate people like him." The silence thickened. Out in the hallway, a junior executive was already typing. A text, a tweet, a leak. Within minutes, the message would be out. A black CEO just turned down a $900 million merger because someone insulted his mother. It wouldn't need spin. It wouldn't need video. The story would carry itself because it wasn't about business anymore. It was about a man who refused to trade his name, his roots, or his mother's dignity for a seat at someone else's table. And inside that polished boardroom built on legacy and leverage, no one could pretend the air hadn't shifted. Because now every handshake felt a little more hollow, every nod a little more performative. And that pen, the one meant to seal the future, now looked like a relic from a past no one wanted to own. Victoria finally spoke. "He'll be back." But no one answered her. Not because they disagreed, but because they weren't sure anymore. And outside, Derek Samuels was already walking further away, not from money, but from silence. Not from a deal, but from a system. The kind of walk that starts small but shakes foundations. The kind that history remembers. The world takes notice. The news didn't break, it erupted. By morning, the whispers had turned into headlines. By noon, it was being debated on business panels. By evening, it was everywhere. Black CEO walks away from $900 million deal after mother insulted by billionaire family. That headline alone traveled faster than most press releases ever could. It wasn't because of a scandal. It wasn't because of a financial collapse. It was because a black man did something no one expected. He said no. Loudly, calmly, publicly, and he didn't look back. The first outlet to run it was a small podcast out of Philadelphia. A guest who had been in the room leaked just enough details. No names at first, but the internet did the rest. Faces were matched, timelines were confirmed, videos from past speaking engagements surfaced, interviews, graduation photos. Soon, Derek Samuels became more than a CEO. He became a symbol, and symbols travel. Cable news anchors debated him over breakfast. Talk show hosts invoked his name during late-night monologues. Twitter threads stretched thousands of replies long. TikTok flooded with young black entrepreneurs lip-syncing his quotes over piano music. In a world used to watching people sell their silence for access, his refusal hit different. In New York, the camera caught Derek entering his office the next day. No sunglasses, no entourage, just a coffee in hand and a quiet nod to the front desk receptionist like always. A reporter shouted, "Do you regret walking away from $900 million?" He didn't respond, not then. Inside, his team was already fielding calls. Some investors were confused, some were furious, but a surprising number were proud. Emails flooded the company inbox, not with threats or panic, but with gratitude. Warehouse workers, teachers, nurses, retired veterans, people who had never set foot in a boardroom sent one-line messages. "Thank you for not letting that slide." That afternoon, Derek called a press conference. There were no banners, no publicist walking him through a statement, no sleek backdrop. Just a folding table, a single mic, and 20 reporters crammed into a room built for 10. He stepped up with tired eyes and a still back. "I didn't cancel the deal because of money," he said. "I canceled it because the second you allow disrespect into the room, it spreads. I wasn't raised that way, and I'm not building a future on silence." A CNBC reporter asked the question on everyone's mind. Was it true that the comment about your mother came directly from Victoria Hathaway? Derek didn't flinch. "Yes, loud enough for people to hear, loud enough for my mother to feel." A few heads turned. Someone from the Wall Street Journal leaned forward. "Some might say that's not enough reason to walk away from a billion-dollar opportunity." He nodded slowly. "That depends on what kind of company you're trying to build." Then he stepped back from the mic, just like he had stepped back from the deal. No shouting, no anger, just truth, delivered clean and quiet like a man who had nothing to prove but everything to protect. By that night, clips of his speech had already gone viral. Users stitched his words with their own stories. A former waitress shared how she had been asked to enter a gala through the service entrance. A Latinx caterer told a story about being told to take off her apron before using the front lobby. The comment section burned with truth. People had been too tired, too broke, too scared to speak before. But now they had language. Now they had a face. He didn't plan to start a movement. He just refused to let silence cost him his name, and the world noticed. Black CEO faces backlash from within after refusing billion-dollar deal. The conference room at Samuel's logistics headquarters overlooked Market Street, wide glass walls, black leather chairs, and a whiteboard still streaked with expansion plans. But the atmosphere inside felt far smaller than the space allowed. The kind of pressure that didn't need yelling. It hummed in silence, in tight jaws and restless fingers. Derek stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, face calm. But he could feel it, the tension growing not from outside, but from the people he had built everything with. His CFO, Elliot Trammell, was the first to break. We need to talk about what this means long-term, not just the next few weeks. He didn't sound angry, just exhausted, like a man who had watched the numbers shift overnight. We had international infrastructure lined up, Derek, distribution across 6 new markets. That deal was our key to scale. Derek nodded, I know. And now it's gone, said Julian Ricks, COO, more bluntly. You just walked away from a 9-figure opportunity and didn't even talk to us first. Derek didn't flinch. I made a decision I could live with. Julian leaned back, arms folded. You made a decision the rest of us now have to survive. The words landed harder than he intended. Nia Whitlow, head of marketing, looked between them, her voice softer but just as clear. Derek, I support what you did. I do. But you've become the story now. The headline, you're not just our CEO anymore, you're a symbol. And symbols carry weight. Well, I didn't ask for that. Doesn't matter, she said. You have it. He walked slowly toward the window, watching people cross the street below. A mother holding her daughter's hand. A man in a hoodie pushing a dolly stacked with boxes. Ordinary lives, quiet dignity. He had always built with them in mind. Julian's voice came again. You think the board won't panic? We've got Series C investors calling for explanations. Some want you to walk it back, publicly. Derek turned, I won't. You'd rather let this company fall. If we fall, he said, we fall with dignity. But we will not rot from the inside. The room went still. Elliot exhaled through his nose and tapped the table twice with his pen. I had 2 calls this morning, both investors. They want a plan, something solid. Something that doesn't start with press conferences and end with lawsuits. Nia leaned in. We're already seeing narratives form, people trying to spin it like you killed the deal over ego, that you made it personal. Derek looked at her. It wasn't personal, it was principle. You need to control the story, Derek, she said, or someone else will. He looked down for a long second, then back up. Let them talk. I'm not trading my mother's dignity for market buzz. That kind of growth isn't growth. It's rot dressed up in quarterly reports. A pause stretched across the room. Then, surprisingly, Nia nodded. Slowly, so did Elliot. Julian shook his head, still frustrated, but didn't push again. We'll hold, Elliot said, for now. It wasn't agreement, not fully, but it was something close to trust. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, Derek knew the fight wasn't over, because the hardest battles weren't the ones in front of cameras. They were the ones that happened behind closed doors, in rooms full of people who remembered you before the headlines. The ones who loved you but loved stability more. And still, he chose the harder road. Because if the ground was going to shake, then let it. He'd rather rebuild from rubble than stand tall on rot. Hathaway family refuses to apologize, and it starts to cost them. Inside the Hathaway estate in Greenwich, everything was still polished. Chandeliers gleamed, the mahogany glowed, and the antique vases stood untouched in their alcoves. But beneath the surface, something was crumbling. Victoria Hathaway sat at the head of a long conference table in the family's private study. Her fingers were laced tightly under her chin. Her pearl necklace sat heavy on her collarbone, unmoved, just like her pride. Clinton Hathaway, her eldest son, paced slowly behind her. His voice was sharper than usual. This isn't going away, Mother. Across from him, Bradley, the youngest, scrolled through his phone, frowning deeper with every swipe. It's everywhere. Derek's speech. It's viral. Podcasts are quoting it. TikTok is flooding with reaction videos. There's even a sermon clip using his walkout as a modern parable. Victoria didn't look up. They always scream for a week, then they forget. Clinton stopped pacing. They're not forgetting you became the headline, you personally. Not the company, not the board, you. Eleanor Wynne, their crisis PR manager, cleared her throat from the end of the table. Her tone was professional but strained. We need to issue a statement, not a legal one, a real one. Something that sounds like remorse, like accountability. Victoria finally spoke. I'm not apologizing to the help. The words dropped like a stone. Clinton blinked. Bradley lowered his phone. Eleanor stared. You just said that. Out loud, in front of your sons. In front of the woman trying to protect your legacy. Victoria waved a hand. That woman looked like she didn't belong. That's not my fault. Clinton leaned forward, voice tighter. She was his mother. And I didn't know that. You didn't care to know. Eleanor snapped her binder shut. We can't spin that. She stood, calm but final. If that's your position, then I can't represent you any further. I'm not losing my firm's credibility to shield you from your own arrogance. As she left the room, the silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was terrifying. Victoria sipped her wine, trying to hold onto the illusion of control. But even her own reflection in the glass looked different now. Later that night, the Hathaway family released a public statement. It was cold, vague, buried in legal terms. It called the event a miscommunication and regrettable. It emphasized their commitment to inclusive values, but never once used the words sorry or wrong. The backlash only grew. Brand partners began pulling out of future ventures. A museum board rescinded Victoria's honorary chair. A tech startup withdrew its joint development contract, citing irreconcilable ethical values. Shareholders began to call. What did you say? One asked Clinton privately. How do you lose a billion-dollar merger over a comment? But he couldn't give them an answer that made it sound better, because he knew the truth. His mother didn't just say the wrong thing, she believed it. And the world had changed while she stayed still. In rooms where money once bought silence, people were now speaking. Loudly, boldly, and those who had always held the doors now found themselves standing alone. Elitism had met its moment, and old money had finally cracked. Hathaway family tries to flip the story, but his mother speaks. It began with a whisper, a carefully placed op-ed in a mid-tier finance outlet, then a leaked memo. A former associate quoted anonymously. Suddenly, headlines began to shift. Did the CEO act emotionally? Is Derek Samuels too reactive for high-stakes mergers? Inside boardrooms, phrases like executive temperament and overpersonalization of leadership started circulating. Not from those who knew Derek, but from those who had never once shaken his hand. The Hathaway machine was doing what it had always done best, reframing truth with polish. Victoria didn't just want the deal back. She wanted the narrative, and she wanted him diminished. They're spinning it, Nia said as she walked into Derek's office holding a printed article. Calling you unpredictable, saying you tanked the merger out of pride. Derek read the headline but not the words. He leaned back in his chair, quiet. They're not just attacking your decision, she continued. They're coming for your character. What do you want me to do? He asked. She answered without hesitation. Tell the truth, but don't say it yourself. Let others do it. And that's how it began. Not with a press blitz. Not with a lawyered-up rebuttal, but with the people who had lived what the Hathaways had never seen. A former warehouse manager from Detroit recorded a 1-minute video. He helped my daughter get into college when I couldn't co-sign the loan. No cameras, just kindness. A delivery driver from Oakland posted a photo of his medical bill, stamped, paid in full by the company. Didn't ask for it. Just found out one day my kid's surgery had been covered. A janitor from the New Jersey facility posted his first selfie. He walked past 100 suits to shake my hand on my last day before retirement. Nobody ever did that before. And then came the one voice no spin could compete with. Gloria Samuels, seated in her small living room framed by a modest bookcase and the soft hum of a window fan, she looked straight at the camera. She wore no makeup, no pearls. Just her favorite church dress and the hat they had tried to humiliate. "I didn't ask to be a headline," she said softly, "but I raised my son to speak when silence costs too much." She paused, her hands resting gently in her lap. "And some money," she smiled faintly. "Some money comes with chains. I'm too old to wear chains." The video landed like thunder. No music, no edits, just a black mother telling the truth. It went viral in hours, shared by influencers. Quoted by scholars, remixed into songs, played in classrooms. A preacher in Atlanta built his entire Sunday sermon around her words. "You hear that?" he said from the pulpit. "Chains. Some of y'all been wearing them so long, you forgot how free sounds." Back at Hathaway headquarters, the damage was clear. The PR firm stopped returning calls. A luxury brand postponed a collaboration with the family. A university rescinded an honorary award. Victoria tried again. She released another statement, this one longer, more emotional, with phrases like misinterpreted tone and unintended consequences. But it was too late. The story had moved beyond her. Because in a world tired of empty apologies and polished lies, one quiet voice had cut through. And it was Derek's. It was his mother, S. A letter from the past makes Black CEO confront his pain. It arrived without fanfare. No courier, no bold label, no legal stamp. Just a plain off-white envelope mixed in with bills and vendor quotes on Derek's desk. His name was typed clean across the front. No return address. No logo. He almost tossed it aside. But something, the weight of it maybe, or how quiet the room felt in that moment, made him open it. The paper inside was thick, lined faintly. The handwriting curved carefully, like the writer had practiced each loop and stroke before pressing the pen down. "Mr. Samuels, you don't know me, but I know who you are. My father worked as the groundskeeper at Hathaway Ridge from 1985 until he died in 2009. He raised me and my two sisters on that job. Woke up before the sun, never complained. Taught us to be proud even when we were invisible. I saw your story on the news and I cried. Not because I was surprised by what happened to your mother, but because for once someone said no, and meant it. You reminded me of my father. He never had your platform, but he had your spine, with deep respect." Camille Pierce. Derek stared at the signature. The name stirred something he hadn't felt in years. He leaned back in his chair. The hum of the city outside his window faded. In his chest, a tight knot of exhaustion and memory pulled taut. He told no one about the letter that day. Not yet. That evening, he visited his mother in Trenton. Gloria was watering her basil planter in the backyard. The sun had dipped low, painting the grass gold. He stood there quietly, watching her clip a few leaves into a small bowl. "Ma," he said, not looking directly at her. "You ever think maybe I made it harder than it had to be?" She didn't answer right away. "I think the world already made it hard," she said. "You just stopped pretending it was." He nodded slowly. "I got a letter today from the daughter of a groundskeeper, said I reminded her of him." Gloria paused, then smiled faintly without turning. Funny how truth reaches us, doesn't matter the route. But the next day, truth came knocking louder. Thuron, his cousin and co-founder, showed up unannounced. They met in the break room between rows of vending machines and a flickering ceiling light. "I just got off the phone with Monroe Bank," Thuron said. "They're pausing our West Coast credit line. You know what that means." Derek didn't answer. Thuron stepped closer. "We were building something, man, for our kids, for legacy, and you torched it for a headline." "I didn't do it for a headline," Derek said calmly. "I did it for her. For every time she was looked past, talked over, and treated like she didn't belong." Thuron folded his arms. Maybe that was her fight to pick. "No," Derek said. "She wasn't fighting, she was being stepped on." Thuron's voice dropped lower. "You should have talked to me first. I couldn't talk this one through. I had to feel it." And he did, but feelings didn't balance budgets, and loyalty didn't pay vendors. Behind the scenes, his team worked double time to keep operations smooth. But cracks were forming. Some employees quietly questioned the company's future. Some investors stopped returning calls. The storm Derek expected had finally arrived, not from Hathaway, but from within his own circle. And yet, in the middle of all that, he found himself holding Camille's letter again. He folded it once, then slid it into his coat pocket like armor, because not every wound bleeds. Some just sit there, quiet, until you finally admit that standing up comes with a price, and he was still willing to pay it. Black CEO rushes to hospital after mother collapses from stress. The call came just past 8 in the evening. A nurse, soft-spoken, careful with every word. "Your mother fainted during her Bible study. We've brought her in for precaution. She's stable now, but we'd like to run some tests." By the time Derek reached the hospital, the sky had turned black, the streets wet with mist. His headlights cut through the night like a warning. Inside room 312, Gloria Samuels sat propped up on a pillow, arms folded, sipping ginger ale from a plastic cup. "I told them I just stood up too fast," she said as he walked in. "It didn't need all this fuss." But Derek didn't buy it. He saw the tremble in her hand when she set the cup down. He saw the fatigue behind her smile. Not weakness, just the wear of being strong too long. He sat beside her, close, quiet. "What did the doctor say?" "That I need to take my iron pills and stop skipping greens. Same thing I tell you." He chuckled, but the knot in his chest stayed tight. A few minutes later, Dr. Maylin entered. She was young, composed, her tone gentle but honest. "Her vitals stabilized quickly," she said. "But we're seeing some irregularities, minor but worth monitoring, slight arrhythmia, possibly a valve issue. Nothing urgent, but not nothing either." Gloria waved her hand. "I'm fine." Derek didn't say a word. He just reached over and took her wrist, holding it in his palm like it might slip away. Later that night, the two of them sat watching an old rerun of Sanford and Son on the small hospital TV. The laugh track played low. She chuckled at a line, then turned to him with the softest eyes. "You've done good, baby." He raised an eyebrow. "Did you just call me baby in front of the nurse?" "I brought you into this world. I get to call you baby." He smiled but didn't laugh. Not fully. Something about this moment felt too real to joke through. "I'm not done yet," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but don't wait too long to live." That landed harder than anything else that night. He looked at her again, really looked. The lines around her mouth, the stories behind her hands. This woman who never asked for applause had become the moral spine of a national reckoning. Not by accident, but by simply standing tall. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about legacy, about not handing down silence." She didn't speak, just listened. "I want to start something, a foundation for working people, for the ones like Dad, the ones like you, healthcare screenings, childcare stipends, tuition help, real support." She looked at him, proud but firm. You don't have to do that. I do, he said, because you built me. He sat with her words all the way home. That night he drafted the outline, called Nia first thing in the morning. I want to name it the Gloria Initiative, he said. And I don't want it flashy, I want it real. A few weeks later, the initiative launched. No red carpet, no celebrity endorsements, just a video, just his voice. Just her name. The first press coverage didn't come from the business world. It came from a neighborhood paper in Trenton, then a local radio segment in Newark, then a national feature. And always, always the same line was quoted. Some money comes with chains. I'm too old to wear chains. What began with a humiliation became something else. Not revenge, not payback, but healing. And for the first time since walking out of that marble hall, Derek didn't feel like he was fighting. He felt like he was planting. Black CEO hosts community event that reclaims his legacy. The sun rose slow and golden over the city, casting soft light on the old rec center lot that had once been nothing but cracked concrete and rusted fences. Now it buzzed with life. Food trucks lined one side, giving out plates of catfish, mac and cheese, and collard greens. On the other side, a local jazz band played smooth, warm melodies while kids chased balloons across fresh-cut grass. In the center of it all stood Derek Samuels. No suit, no bodyguards, just jeans, sneakers, and a t-shirt that read the Gloria Initiative. It wasn't a launch party. It wasn't a press event. It was a homecoming. Volunteers in bright shirts handed out free backpacks, stocked with school supplies. A nurse's station offered free health screenings. On the basketball court, former interns ran games with local teens, cheering every jump shot like it was the NBA Finals. A woman from the crowd tapped Derek's arm. "You remember me?" she asked. "I used to clean offices in your old building, third floor, janitorial team." Derek smiled. "I remember your peach-scented cleaner. You used to sing gospel at 6 a.m. She laughed, "Still do." Later, Thuron stood at the grill flipping burgers, sweat on his brow, apron crooked. "I still think you're wild for walking away from that deal," he muttered. Derek sipped from a bottle of water and glanced around at the crowd. "You see this," he said. "I turned down $900 million, but this is worth more." Children darted through the crowd, chasing soap bubbles. An old man in a wheelchair wiped tears as a young volunteer adjusted his hat. A teenage girl read aloud from a table stacked with books, her voice clear and steady. Then came the moment no one expected. Gloria walked slowly up to the microphone set at the small wooden stage. The music stopped. The crowd quieted. She didn't need to raise her voice. "I didn't come here today to be honored," she began. "I came here to see the seeds. And y'all, you're blooming." She looked at her son. "I didn't raise him to be rich. I raised him to be right." Applause broke out like thunder, long-standing, full of joy. Derek stood off to the side, eyes glassy, not because he was proud, but because he was grateful. Grateful that the fight hadn't ended in the boardroom. Grateful that from rejection came rebirth. From insult came intention. And from one black woman's quiet dignity came a movement. This wasn't about profit anymore. It was about people. It was never a fall from grace. It was a rise into purpose. Estranged uncle calls black CEO with message that changes everything. The voicemail came late, past midnight, past logic, the kind of hour when the city sleeps but old wounds stir. Derek noticed it just as he was powering down for the night. A number he didn't recognize. No name, no text, just one message. He pressed play. The voice was raspy, hesitant, like it hadn't been used in years. "Hey, it's Dwayne. I know it's been too long. I saw what you did. On the news, with the merger with your mama, I've been sitting here just thinking about your daddy, about everything. There was a long pause, then the voice cracked. You became the kind of man we all wished we had the courage to be. I wasn't there when you needed me, but if you'll have me, I'd like to change that. Click, Derek didn't move for a long time. Uncle Dwayne, his father's younger brother. The man who vanished after the funeral. The man who left a silence so loud it became part of the house, part of the grief. The last memory Derek had of him was from age 9, a tall, laughing man holding a worn guitar, singing Sam Cooke in the backyard while ribs sizzled on the grill. And then nothing, just stories, regret, and his mother's tired shrug whenever his name came up. He wasn't built to carry pain, she used to say, so he ran from it. But now, after years of absence, the man who disappeared was calling not for money, not for a spotlight, but for peace. The next day, Derek sat across from Gloria at her kitchen table. He left a voicemail, he said. Uncle Dwayne. She didn't flinch, just placed her tea down slowly. Is he okay? He wants to see me. She looked out the window for a moment, then nodded. Sometimes, the ones who vanish are the ones who needed love the most. The meeting happened at a quiet diner on the edge of Trenton. No cameras, no handlers, just two men sitting in a booth, sunlight cutting through blinds, catching the dust in the air like a halo. Derek walked in first. Dwayne was already there, older, grayer, leaner, but the same eyes, same hands. You look like your daddy, Dwayne said, standing up, eyes wet. But your fire, that's your mama. Derek sat down. Neither of them touched the menu. I waited a long time to hear from you, he said. I waited a long time to feel worthy enough to call, Dwayne replied. There was no dramatic embrace, no tearful apology speech, just truth, simple and raw. I ran because I was scared, Dwayne admitted. Scared I'd fail him, scared I'd fail you, but watching you stand up like that, it woke something in me. Derek stared at his uncle's face, saw the lines grief carved, the shame, the longing, but also the strength it took to show up now. I'm not looking to rewrite the past, Derek said, but maybe we can write something new. Dwayne nodded slowly. I'd like that. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in golden spirals. Inside, a silence settled, not awkward, not tense, but clean, like something heavy had finally been set down. Back at his office, Derek sat with it all. The boy who once felt abandoned was now a man making peace, not because he forgot, but because he grew stronger than the hurt. Forgiveness had entered the frame, not as surrender, but as power. And sometimes that's the boldest legacy of all. Black CEO meets woman whose letter sparked his turning point. The porch was small, wrapped in chipped white paint and blooming azaleas. Wind chimes tinkled softly as Derek stepped onto the steps, holding the letter that had changed everything. It was folded carefully in his coat pocket, worn from the number of times he'd read it. Camille Pierce opened the door with a warm, weathered smile. She was in her 60s, wearing a floral house dress and soft-soled slippers. Her eyes, clear, calm, and unflinching, held the kind of grace time doesn't steal. You came, she said, not surprised. You gave me something I didn't know I needed, Derek replied. They sat in the living room where every photo on the wall told a story. Camille handed him a glass of sweet tea, the kind that clung to the ice like syrup. On the coffee table sat a single black and white picture in a wooden frame, a man in a groundskeeper's uniform, standing in front of the Hathaway estate. My father, she said, worked their gardens for 30 years, never missed a day. He was never mentioned, Derek said, voice low. No, sir, she said gently. He wasn't meant to be remembered, that's how they kept their power. She picked up the photograph and ran her thumb along the edge of the frame. But he kept notes, everything, every time Mr. Hathaway called him boy. Every time they made him wait out back instead of coming through the front. He'd come home, hang up his hat, and say, "Camille, dignity ain't about being seen. It's about refusing to shrink." Derek listened like a student in the presence of scripture. "Your letter," he said, "it found me when I almost forgot why I started this." "I wrote it because I saw your mama's face," Camille said. "It looked just like mine when I was 16 and watched them laugh while my daddy swept the same marble steps every morning." There was silence, not awkward, sacred. "I used to think justice would be loud," Derek said, "but sometimes it whispers through people like you." She smiled gently. "Loud fades, dignity stays." They sat for nearly 2 hours, talking about names erased from history, about ancestors who never had headlines but carried entire generations on their backs. As he stood to leave, Camille pressed something into his hand. It was a folded napkin. Inside, a photograph, her father in his work boots standing beside a young Camille. He was smiling, not wide, but enough to know he was proud. "I want you to have this," she said. "I can't." "You will." "Because your fight is his too, just further down the road." Back in his car, Derek didn't start the engine. He just stared at the photo. Legacy, he realized, didn't always come with applause or press releases. Sometimes it lived in the soil someone else tilled, in stories passed down by mouth, in a single letter that reached the right hands at the right moment. Sometimes legacy lived in small things, and it was enough to change everything. Black Mother's final words pushed Son toward his true calling. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the faint tap of rain against the window. The sky outside was gray, gentle. Derek sat beside the bed, his mother's hand resting in his. Her skin, once so firm and strong, now felt like tissue paper, delicate, warm, but thinning with time. Gloria's eyes opened slowly, still sharp, still watching. "You've been here 3 nights," she said. "I'll stay 3 more," Derek replied. She gave a soft chuckle. "Boy, I didn't raise you to sit still. You got too much light to just be a bedside lamp." Derek smiled, but his eyes stayed heavy. "I just want to make sure you're okay." She turned her head toward him. "You want to honor me," she whispered. "Then don't wait too long to live." He looked at her surprised. "You always think you'll have more time," she said. "More time to speak, to build, to rest. But time is tricky. Sometimes it runs out without warning. So you move now, while you can, not for applause, for purpose." She took a breath, then added, softer, "Redemption ain't just about making things right with others. Sometimes it's about making peace with what you almost lost in yourself." Later that night, Derek stood in the hallway just outside her door, hands in his pockets, staring out over the city lights. Rain drizzled down the glass like threads unraveling from the sky. He thought about the last few months, the deal, the humiliation, the backlash, the stand. And now this, a mother's final lesson, offered not in anger, not in urgency, but in love. By morning, he'd made a decision. The Gloria Initiative wouldn't just hand out grants. It would buy back properties in underserved Black communities. It would build clinics, fund schools, restore libraries that were shut down and left to rot. It would hire mothers, fathers, returning citizens, and youth overlooked by the very systems that claimed to serve them. And it would do it without compromise. No boardroom gatekeepers. No glossy whitewashed filters. It would be raw, real. Radical, he didn't need press conferences or PR firms, he needed trust. And truth. At sunrise, he sat by Gloria's side again. She was asleep, lips parted in rest, her chest rising and falling gently beneath the blanket. Derek leaned down close and whispered, "You didn't just teach me how to live, you taught me who to live for." Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky, now painted with streaks of gold, hinted at something new. Not just another morning, but the beginning of legacy reborn. Black CEO faces final test after refusing $900 million for his mother. The city skyline shimmered behind him as Derek stood on the rooftop of his company's headquarters, the wind brushing against his face like memory. Below, the streets pulsed with life, horns, voices, motion. But up here it was quiet. It was reflection. Inside, reporters still tried to spin headlines. The Hathaway empire was unraveling. Stockholders were panicking. Victoria had disappeared from public view. Their legal team sent a final offer, hush money disguised as reconciliation. Derek didn't even open the envelope. That chapter had closed the moment his mother was called the help. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about release. He walked through the hallway toward the Gloria Initiative's new office wing. The walls still smelled of fresh paint and possibility. Along the corridor were framed portraits of families helped by the program. A young father receiving his first loan. A single mother signing her daughter into preschool. A former inmate now managing a logistics fleet. None of them knew about the $900 million he turned down, but all of them were living proof of why he did. That afternoon, he sat with his team at a round table. No corner offices, no titles on the door, just people. Equal, focused. "Where do we go next?" one staffer asked. Derek leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on the worn leather notebook he'd carried since college. "We go wherever silence lives," he said, "and we break it." Later that evening, he visited the rehab center where Gloria now recovered. Her strength had returned. Not fully, but enough to sit up, sip tea, and smile like a queen on her throne. "I saw the news," she said, smirking. "I didn't say anything to the press," Derek replied. "Didn't need to," she said. "You already said it when you walked out that room." He sat beside her, watching the light from the window land on her face. "You always told me never to let money define me," he said. Gloria nodded slowly. "And you listened." They sat in silence, not heavy, not sad, sacred. "I kept thinking there'd be a moment where I'd feel victorious," he admitted. "But it still hurts." She reached over, placed her hand on his chest. "That's because your heart's still open," she said. "And that, son, is the real victory." As he left, Derek paused by the hospital elevator. The same knot of emotion that started this journey was still in his chest, but it wasn't shame anymore. It was weight and worth. He didn't walk away from wealth. He walked away from silence, from erasure. From the quiet, poisonous ways a system can rob a man of his mother's dignity while shaking his hand in a boardroom. This wasn't just a stand. It was a reckoning. And it all began with a hat, a name, and a mother who taught her son that some doors are not worth walking through unless you walk in standing tall. Even if it costs everything. Sometimes standing up doesn't mean shouting. It means walking away. From noise, from disrespect, from systems that pretend not to see. Derek's story reminds us that dignity isn't something you earn, it's something you protect. That behind every quiet no lies a history, a mother, a memory, a line that should never be crossed. Let this story be a gentle reminder: success means nothing if it costs your soul. And true power, it's choosing purpose over profit. If this moved you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how this story speaks to you. And don't miss what's coming next. We'll keep telling the stories that need to be told, of struggle, of injustice, of breathtaking triumphs from Black voices history tried to silence. Stories that will surprise you, inspire you, and remind you of what it means to rise. Stay with us, the journey's just beginning.